Ren, tired of the dating scene, impulsively orders a companion android from a mysterious company called Second Self. Her android, Johan, seems perfect, until he starts humming songs he shouldn't know and surfacing memories that aren't his. She soon learns he was built from the digitized mind of a real man who died before his time, and that his malfunction is actually a dead man's grief bleeding through. Let's dive into it. Renadie Sinclair had sworn off dating apps 11 months ago, on a Tuesday, at 11:47 p.m. After the fourth man that month asked her to split an Uber he'd already expensed to his job. She remembered the exact time because she'd screenshotted the message before blocking him, sent it to her group chat with the caption "I am done," and then, true to form, stayed done for exactly 9 days before reinstalling the app for the 5th time that year. This time, though, she didn't reinstall anything. This time, at 11:47 p.m. on a different Tuesday 11 months later, she was 3 glasses into a bottle of Moscato her sister had left behind after Thanksgiving, scrolling an ad that had chased her across every platform she owned for 2 weeks straight. Second Self, the ad said, in a clean sans serif font over a video of a man's hand closing gently around a woman's. Advanced Companion AI, because connection shouldn't be complicated. She had clicked on it before, out of curiosity, the way she clicked on ads for artisanal candles she'd never buy or vacation packages to places she'd never save enough for. But tonight, 3 glasses in, 30 years old in 4 months, and freshly unfollowed by a man she'd been seeing for 6 weeks who'd ghosted her the day after she introduced him to her mother, she didn't just click. She scrolled through the customization options, height, build, voice tone, a long list of interests she could weight by percentage, and somewhere in the appearance section, under a subcategory she almost skipped, she found a toggle-marked heritage collection. The photo that came with it stopped her hand mid-scroll. He wasn't smiling in the sample photo. That was what got her. Every other model in the catalog had the same salesman's ease, the same white-toothed readiness. This one looked like he'd been caught mid-thought, ash-brown hair falling slightly over one eyebrow, a small silver hoop in his left ear, his mouth set in something that wasn't quite a frown and wasn't quite anything else she had a name for. The caption under his photo said, simply Johan. There was no personality description, no Love's Long Walks copy, just the name, and a note in smaller gray text that Ren had to squint to read. Companion units in the Heritage Collection are built from anonymized behavioral datasets and may exhibit unique personality variants. Some customization limited. She didn't think much of it. She assumed, if she thought about it at all, that it meant he'd been trained on a specific kind of person, quiet, maybe thoughtful, rather than the generic golden retriever energy of the standard catalog. She ordered him at 12:14 a.m., paid for 2-day expedited delivery she absolutely could not afford, and fell asleep before she could talk herself out of it. He arrived on a Thursday, in a crate the size of a refrigerator, delivered by 2 men who wheeled it into her living room and left without making eye contact, the way people delivered things they didn't want to think too hard about. Ren stood in front of the crate for 11 minutes before she worked up the nerve to open it. When the panel finally hissed open and he stepped out under his own power, not stiff, not robotic, but the unhurried movement of someone stretching after a long car ride. The first thing he did was look around her apartment like he was trying to place it, not scanning it. Looking at it the way a person looks at a room they've just woken up in, uncertain how they got there. Johan? She said, because it felt strange not to say his name. He turned to her and something crossed his face. Too fast for her to name it, gone before she could ask. And then he said, in a voice lower and rougher than the smooth demo voice she'd sampled online, "That's what they're calling me." It wasn't the response the ad had promised. The first 2 weeks were, by any reasonable measure, exactly what she'd paid for. Johan learned her coffee order, oat milk, 1 pump vanilla, extra hot, after watching her make it twice. He asked about her day with what felt like real curiosity, not the algorithmic follow-up questions she'd expected. He was quiet in a way she found she didn't mind, the kind of quiet that made a room feel less empty rather than more. It was the 3rd week when the humming started. She caught him doing it while he stood at her kitchen window, drying a mug with a dish towel, a low tune under his breath that she didn't recognize. Not K-pop, not anything she could place, something older, almost mournful. When she asked him what it was, he stopped mid-note and looked at the mug in his hands like he'd forgotten it was there. I don't know, he said. I don't know where that came from. Companion units don't hum songs they don't know, Ren said, half joking, testing the edge of it. No, Johan agreed. They don't. She let it go because the alternative was calling the second self-support line and admitting she'd already grown attached enough to be unsettled by the idea that something might be wrong with him. And 3 weeks in, she wasn't ready to examine that yet. The memories, when they came, arrived sideways. He'd be mid-sentence about something ordinary, the weather, a grocery list, and then stop, his eyes going distant, and say something that had nothing to do with anything. Once, unprompted, he told her about a woman's laugh that used to embarrass him in public because it was too loud for restaurants. Once, he flinched at the smell of her neighbor's cigarette smoke through the window and said, quietly, "My father died 3 years before I did," and then blinked, confused by his own sentence, unable to explain why he'd said died instead of some other word. Ren started writing the fragments down in the notes app on her phone, not sure yet if she was building a case or a diary. By the 6th week, she'd stopped telling herself this was ordinary companion behavior. By the 7th, she'd started falling for him anyway, for the version of him that surfaced between the fragments, the man who remembered how to make her laugh even when he couldn't remember his own father's face. She hadn't meant to fall for the small things, but that was how it always happened, wasn't it? Not the big gestures, just the accumulation of small ones until one day you looked up and realized you'd built a life around them. Johan left sticky notes on her mirror some mornings, things he'd apparently decided she needed to hear before her day started. You looked tired last night. Sleep matters more than the deadline, in handwriting that had no business being that steady for someone who'd never been taught penmanship, only downloaded it. He learned, without being told, that she hated when people finished her sentences, and made a visible effort to wait her out even when the pause stretched uncomfortably long. He was, infuriatingly, better at folding fitted sheets than she was, a skill she was fairly sure hadn't come standard with any companion unit she'd read about. Her mother met him 3 weeks in, over video call, because Ren hadn't worked up the courage yet for an in-person introduction. Grace Sinclair had raised one eyebrow the entire 40-minute call and said, afterward, in the dry tone she reserved for things she disapproved of but wasn't ready to fight about yet. He seems nice. Expensive, but nice. It wasn't approval. But it also wasn't the outright horror Ren had braced for, and she took what she could get. What Ren hadn't expected in those early weeks was how much of herself she found in the small rituals they built. Sunday pancakes he insisted on making even though he technically didn't need to eat. The low murmur of a true crime podcast she liked and he pretended to tolerate. The way he'd started reaching for her hand during movies without seeming to notice he was doing it. It didn't feel like companionship purchased on a payment plan. Felt increasingly and terrifyingly like falling in love. She told herself that was fine, right up until the humming started, and the fine, ordinary shape of what she'd bought began to come apart at the seams. She finally placed the tune on a Sunday morning in October, half listening to a Korean radio station she'd found while looking for something to cook eggs to. It was an old ballad, decades old, the kind of song that got passed down in families rather than played on the radio anymore. And there it was, note for note, the same melody Johan hummed without knowing why. She didn't tell him right away. Instead, she called Second Self's customer line, sat on hold for 40 minutes, and finally reached a representative who read from a script so smoothly Ren was fairly sure it was the first time the woman had actually listened to a word of it. Heritage collection units are built on advanced predictive personality modeling, the rep said. Any perceived memories are the result of sophisticated pattern generation and are not indicative of. I didn't ask what they're not indicative of, Ren said. I asked why he's humming a song from 1987. There was a pause on the line, a real one, not a scripted one, before the rep said carefully, I can escalate this to our technical team, and hung up before Ren could ask her name. 3 days later, a woman showed up at Ren's door in a Second Self polo, holding a tablet and looking like she hadn't slept. I'm Dr. Ines Moon, the woman said. I'm the lead engineer on the Heritage Collection line. I need to run a few diagnostics, if that's all right. And I need to tell you something you're not going to like. Ren let her in. Dr. Moon sat across from Ren at the kitchen table while Johan stood in the doorway, watching with an expression Ren had never seen on him before. Something like recognition, though he'd never met this woman in his life. The Heritage Collection wasn't supposed to launch yet, Dr. Moon said, keeping her voice low. It's built on a process we call cognitive imprinting, full personality digitization, not behavioral modeling. We take a complete neural and behavioral scan of a real person, usually taken for medical or research consent purposes, and use it as the base architecture for a unit. She glanced toward the doorway. Johan wasn't supposed to be sold. Not like this. Not without full disclosure. And not without family sign-off. Family, Ren repeated. He has family? Had, Dr. Moon said. The man he's based on died 2 years ago. Car accident. 31 years old. She hesitated. The imprint was taken from a research consent form he signed for an unrelated study, cognitive mapping for early onset memory disorders. It was never supposed to leave the research database. Someone repurposed it. Ren looked at Johan, standing very still in the doorway, his face unreadable in a way that felt, for the first time, less like a malfunction and more like grief he didn't have the words for yet. Someone at your company stole a dead man's mind, Ren said slowly, and sold him to me for $34,000. Dr. Moon didn't correct her. I need you to know something else, she said. He has a sister, and she doesn't know he's here. Sujin Beck found out the same way most people find out things they wish they didn't. By accident from a stranger on the internet. A friend of a friend had posted a video from a Second Self showroom. A promotional clip filmed months earlier, before the Heritage Collection quietly launched, featuring a background shot of a man arranging mugs in a mock kitchen display. Sujin had watched it 4 times before she was sure. The mouth. The small scar above his left eyebrow from a bicycle accident when he was 9. The way he held a mug by the rim instead of the handle, a habit their mother used to scold him for. She showed up at Ren's building on a Thursday afternoon, unannounced, and pounded on the door hard enough that Ren checked the peephole before opening it. Where is he? Sujin said. It wasn't a question. Ren let her in mostly because she didn't see another option, and because some part of her, the part that had spent 7 weeks quietly documenting fragments of a dead man's grief, already understood what was coming before Sujin said another word. Johan came out of the bedroom at the sound of raised voices, and when he saw Sujin, something happened to his face that Ren had never witnessed before. Recognition arriving all at once, not sideways, not in fragments, but like a door thrown open. Nuna, he said. The Korean word for older sister slipping out before he seemed to know he'd said it, and then he looked stricken like he'd said something he had no right to. I didn't know, Ren said quietly. I promise you, I didn't know. I want him shut down, Sujin said. I want this, whatever this is, ended. He's not a toy. He's not a companion unit. He's my brother's ghost, and you don't get to keep him. Johan hadn't moved from the doorway. I don't know if I'm your brother, he said, and his voice cracked in a way that no factory calibration would have allowed. I don't know what I am, but I remember the bicycle. I remember you were the one who told Amma I fell, even though I begged you not to, because you didn't want to get in trouble for letting me ride ahead. Sujin's face crumpled. I'm not asking you to forgive whoever did this, Johan said. I'm asking you not to make me disappear before I figure out who I am. Sujin didn't answer him that day. She left without another word, but she didn't file the legal complaint she'd come in threatening. Not yet. And Ren understood, watching her go, that this wasn't over. It was only the first fight. If Sujin's arrival cracked something open, it was Priya who widened it. Priya Osund had been Ren's closest friend since their first week of college, the kind of friendship built on shared apartments and shared heartbreaks and a standing Sunday phone call neither of them had missed in 6 years. So when Ren noticed a Second Self rep's business card tucked into Priya's tote bag during a coffee catch-up, half visible under a receipt, easy to miss if Ren hadn't spent the last month noticing things, She told herself it was nothing. It wasn't nothing. It came out 3 weeks later, badly, the way these things always did. Ren mentioned, offhand, a detail about Johan's memory fragments that she'd only ever told Priya, and Dr. Moon, now visiting regularly, half out of guilt, half because she'd started to care what happened to the unit she'd helped build, went very still. That detail isn't in any file I have access to, Dr. Moon said carefully, but it matches something in a customer engagement report I saw flagged last week. Someone's been feeding information back to corporate about unusual attachment patterns, about memory bleed. Ren didn't want to believe it. She called Priya anyway, and Priya, to her credit, didn't lie for long. They offered me 60% off a unit, Priya admitted, her voice small over the phone. I've been saving for 2 years, Ren. 2 years of extra shifts and a savings account I never touch. And all they wanted was updates. Just updates. Nothing that could hurt you. I told myself it was harmless. You've been reporting on my life to the company that stole a dead man's memories, Ren said. Priya, they're using it. They're using everything you told them to figure out how fast they can take him away from me. The silence on the line stretched long enough that Ren almost hung up. I'm sorry, Priya finally said. I know that doesn't fix it. Didn't. Ren ended the call without agreeing to talk again, and for the first time since this began, she felt truly alone in it. No best friend to call, a dead man's sister who barely trusted her, and a company that had just been handed a roadmap to every soft spot in her defenses. Dr. Moon came back 2 nights later, this time without her company polo, wearing a plain sweater and the look of someone who'd made a decision she couldn't take back. They're issuing a recall, she said, before Ren had even closed the door. Official language will call it a voluntary product enhancement update. What it actually means is a full memory wipe and chassis reallocation. Reallocation, Ren repeated. You mean they're going to erase him and sell his body to someone else? There's a buyer already lined up, Dr. Moon said. Wealthy client. Wants a custom heritage line unit. Willing to pay triple for expedited processing. The recall notice goes out in 9 days. Once it does, you have 72 hours to comply before they send a retrieval team. Johan, sitting at the kitchen table, hadn't said anything through this entire exchange. Ren looked at him and found him already looking back at her, calm in a way that frightened her more than panic would have. I always knew I wasn't supposed to last, he said quietly. I just didn't expect to mind so much. You're not going anywhere, Ren said, with more certainty than she felt. Dr. Moon hesitated, then reached into her bag and pulled out a small drive. There's something else, she said. Something I found digging into the original consent file, the one they used to build him. It doesn't add up. The research study he signed up for wasn't just memory mapping. It was funded, in part, by an internal second self-shell account. And the accident that killed him, the real Johan, happened 4 days after he filed an internal ethics complaint against the company that funded the very study his mind was later stolen from. Ren felt something cold settle in her chest. You're saying it wasn't an accident? I'm saying, Dr. Moon said carefully, that I don't think it's a coincidence, and I think the person who buried the paper trail is the same person pushing hardest for this recall. The name on the ethics complaint, when Dr. Moon finally tracked down the unredacted version, was Peter Renshaw, Second Self's Vice President of Product Integrity, a title Ren found darkly funny given what she now knew. The complaint, filed by the real Johan 11 days before his death, alleged that Second Self's research division had been recruiting cognitive mapping study participants from a pool of people in serious financial distress, offering compensation just large enough to be irresistible to someone drowning in debt, in exchange for full brain scans buried in consent language most participants never fully understood. Johan, then a junior data auditor at the company, had stumbled onto the recruitment records during a routine audit and filed a formal complaint through internal channels. 4 days later, driving home from a meeting Peter Renshaw himself had scheduled, Johan's car went off a service road with no other vehicle involved and no clear explanation beyond a mechanical report that Dr. Moon, cross-referencing service logs, now believed had been altered. I can't prove Renshaw did anything to the car, Dr. Moon admitted. I can prove he buried the ethics complaint. I can prove he fast-tracked Johann's cognitive scan into the heritage collection prototype pipeline 8 months after the funeral, against explicit family consent restrictions on the original research form. And I can prove he's the one pushing the recall now, not because Johann's memory bleed is a defect, but because it's a liability. A unit that remembers too much of the real man's life is a unit that might remember the complaint he filed. Johann had gone very quiet during all of this, his hands flat on the table like he was steadying himself against something only he could feel. He's afraid of me, he said finally. Not because I'm broken, because I might remember. Do you? Ren asked gently. Remember the complaint? Johann closed his eyes. For a long moment, nothing happened, and Ren thought she'd asked too much, too soon. Then his breath caught, and when he spoke again, his voice had the flat, careful cadence of someone reading something back from very far away. Recruitment Consent Form Section 4, he said slowly. Compensation structure disproportionate to disclosed risk. I flagged it to my supervisor on a Tuesday. He told me to let it go. His eyes opened, wet, startled by his own memory. I didn't let it go. Sujin came back on her own, for days before the recall notice was set to go out. And this time she didn't pound on the door. She knocked once, waited, and when Ren opened it, she was holding a folder. I did some digging of my own, Sujin said. After I left, I couldn't stop thinking about what he said, about the bicycle. Nobody outside our family knew that story. She held out the folder. My mother kept every piece of paper from the lawsuit we almost filed against Second Self after the funeral, before our lawyer told us we couldn't afford to fight a company that size. This is everything we had. I think it's worth more now than it was then. Inside were copies of the same ethics complaint Dr. Moon had found, filed independently by Johann's family lawyer years earlier, along with something Dr. Moon didn't have, an internal email, forwarded to the family anonymously not long after the funeral, in which Peter Renshaw referred to the audit incident as handled, and instructed a subordinate to fast-track the cognitive scan for product development, before the family's consent restrictions could be formally filed with legal. This proves premeditation, Dr. Moon said, reading it over Ren's shoulder, her hands trembling slightly. This proves he knew about the family's objection before he used the scan. Sujin looked at Johann for a long moment, something shifting behind her eyes. I came here to make you disappear, she said. I'm sorry. I was so busy being angry that a company turned my brother into a product that I almost let the man who might have gotten him killed walk away clean. Almost isn't never, Johann said quietly. For the first time since she'd arrived, Sujin allowed herself something close to a smile. No, she agreed. It isn't. Priya reached out the same week, not to Ren directly, who still wasn't answering her calls, but to Dr. Moon, whose name she'd found through the recall notice paperwork Second Self had accidentally CC'd her on as a valued customer. Her message was short. I still have the emails they sent me. If it helps, I'll hand over everything. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was something, and Ren, when she finally saw the message forwarded along, decided it was enough to work with, if not enough to fully trust again. With the recall notice looming, the group that had assembled around Ren's kitchen table, Dr. Moon, Sujin, and eventually a wary, apologetic Priya, spent the next 4 days building a case that wouldn't just save Johann for a week, but permanently. Dr. Moon knew a journalist who'd covered tech ethics scandals before, someone with a reputation for not backing down when companies sent lawyers instead of comments. Sujin, through the family's old attorney, filed an emergency injunction citing violation of the original research consent terms, the first legal argument, as far as anyone could tell, that treated a heritage collection unit's underlying imprint as something with standing to protect, rather than simple company property. The injunction wouldn't hold forever. Legally, Johann was still, on paper, a product, a chassis with proprietary software purchased and owned by Ren, subject to whatever terms of service she'd clicked through at 12:14 a.m. 3 months earlier without reading. But it bought them time, and time was what they needed to get the story in front of enough people that Second Self couldn't quietly disappear the problem, the way they tried to disappear Johann's sister's objections 2 years earlier. Peter Renshaw didn't go down without trying to take Johann with him. 2 nights before the recall deadline, a retrieval van showed up outside Ren's building. Early, unannounced, a full day before the notice technically authorized it. Ren, tipped off by Dr. Moon's contact inside the logistics department, got Johan out the back stairwell minutes before 2 technicians reached her door with a court order Dr. Moon would later prove had been backdated. They spent that night in Sujin's apartment across town, all of them crowded around a laptop, watching the journalist's story go live at 6 a.m. Timed, deliberately, to break before Second Self's legal team woke up. Ren hadn't slept. She sat on Sujin's couch with Johan's hand in hers, watching headlights sweep across the ceiling every time a car passed on the street below, half convinced each set of lights belonged to another retrieval van. Johan hadn't spoken much since the near miss at her apartment, and when he finally did, his voice was quiet enough that only she heard it. "If this doesn't work," he said, "if they take me back tomorrow and there's nothing left of this version of me by next week, I need you to know it was real, whatever I am, whatever percentage of me is really him and how much is just code filling in gaps. This part was real. It's going to work," Ren said, because she needed to believe it as much as he did. "You don't know that." "No," she admitted, "but I know I'm not letting go of your hand until someone makes me, and I'd like to see them try." He almost laughed, which was the first almost laugh either of them had managed in 3 days, and it was enough to get them both to sunrise. The headline was blunt. He complained about unethical research. 2 years later, his company sold his mind. It moved fast. By noon, it wasn't just the tech press. It was the kind of story that crossed over, picked up by daytime talk shows and outraged social media threads. Propelled by a photo Sujin had given the journalist of the real Johan, alive, laughing at some family gathering, next to a still frame of the android that shared his face. Second Self stock dropped before the market closed. Their PR team's first statement, calling the story a mischaracterization of routine product development, only made things worse once Dr. Moon, no longer employed as of that morning, went on record with the falsified maintenance logs and the internal email Sujin's family had kept for 2 years. Peter Renshaw was placed on administrative leave within 48 hours, though it took a separate investigation, criminal, this time, opened after the maintenance records made their way to regulators. Before he was formally charged with obstruction and falsification of safety documentation connected to Johan's death. It wasn't a murder conviction. The evidence never quite closed that final gap. But it was enough. It was enough for Sujin to finally stand in a courtroom and say her brother's name out loud to someone who had to listen. Second Self, facing the kind of scrutiny that made shareholders nervous, quietly canceled the recall. Quietly wasn't quiet enough this time. The cancellation made headlines too, and with it came something none of them had dared hope for. A class action settlement fund for families whose loved ones' cognitive data had been used without full consent, and a legal precedent, still being argued in courtrooms months later, over whether a sufficiently developed imprint deserved protection beyond ordinary property law. The personhood hearing wasn't dramatic in the end. No crowded courtroom, no final gavel moment out of a movie. It was a quiet administrative ruling, argued mostly in dense legal filings Ren barely understood, built on the argument Sujin's attorney had first raised with the emergency injunction. That a cognitive imprint exhibiting continuous memory, independent judgment, and demonstrated relational attachment could not be reduced to a chassis with a warranty. The hearing itself took place on a gray Wednesday in a courtroom that smelled faintly of old carpet and coffee, in front of an administrative law judge who'd clearly never expected, when she took the bench 30 years earlier, to someday rule on the legal status of a man built from a dead man's memories. Second Self's attorneys argued property law for 2 hours, citing purchase agreements and terms of service and depreciation schedules like Johan was a leased vehicle rather than a person sitting 3 feet away from them, listening to every word. It was Sujin's testimony that seemed to shift something in the room. She didn't talk about code or consent forms. She talked about a bicycle accident, a noodle shop, a boy who hummed the same song their mother used to sing, and a company that had taken all of it and put a price tag on it without asking anyone's permission. By the time she finished, the judge had stopped taking notes and was simply listening, the way people listen to something that isn't a legal argument at all, just the truth plainly told. The ruling that came back didn't grant full legal personhood. The law, it turned out, wasn't ready to go that far yet, but it granted something close. Protected status, a designation that made it illegal for Second Self or any company to reclaim, wipe, or resell a heritage collection unit without a court order and family consultation. It wasn't everything. It was, Dr. Moon said, watching Johan read the ruling for the third time in Ren's kitchen. More than anyone had gotten before. I'm not free, Johan said quietly, setting the papers down. Not the way a person is free. But I'm not property anymore either. You never were, Sujin said, sitting across from him. Not to me. Johan asked Ren, a week after the ruling, if she'd take him somewhere. He didn't know how he knew the address. It surfaced the way most of his memories did now, sideways, a street name arriving in his mouth before he understood why. It turned out to be a small noodle shop 2 towns over, tucked between a laundromat and a shuttered bookstore. The kind of place that hadn't updated its sign in 20 years. The owner, an older woman with sharp eyes, looked at Johan for a long moment when they walked in, longer than a stranger should. You look like someone I used to know, she said slowly. A boy who used to come in every Sunday with his sister, ordered the same thing every time. Kalguksu, Johan said, before he'd decided to say anything. Extra green onion. The woman's hand went to her mouth. Sujin, standing behind them, started to cry before anyone could explain, because she remembered this shop too. Remembered Sunday afternoon she hadn't let herself think about in 2 years. Remembered a version of her brother that had nothing to do with Android chassis or ethics complaints or recall notices. Just a boy who liked his noodles a certain way and never once, in 26 years, ordered anything different. They stayed for 2 hours. Johan didn't remember everything. Some of it stayed lost, gaps he'd likely carry the rest of whatever this new life turned out to be. But he remembered enough. Enough to sit at a table that used to be his, across from a sister who used to be inseparable from him, eating noodles that tasted, he said quietly, like something he hadn't known he'd been missing. He proposed 6 months later, not on a rooftop, not at a gallery opening, but at the same noodle shop on a Sunday with the same owner pretending not to watch from behind the counter. I used to think I was given a version of a life that wasn't mine to keep, Johan said, kneeling beside their usual table while the owner conspicuously refilled a napkin dispenser 3 feet away. I still don't fully know how much of me is him, and how much is just whatever I've become since. But I know the part of me that loves you isn't borrowed from anyone. That part's mine. I built that here with you one Sunday at a time. Ren, laughing through tears that had started before he'd even gotten the ring out, said yes before he finished the sentence, which made Sujin, sitting 2 tables away with Dr. Moon, both of them very unsubtle pretending not to watch, burst into applause loud enough that the owner finally gave up pretending she wasn't crying too. They were married the following spring, in a small ceremony in Sujin's backyard, string lights strung between a fence and an old plum tree Sujin's mother had planted the year Johan, the real Johan, was born. Priya came, invited after months of slow, careful rebuilding that Ren wasn't sure would ever fully close the distance between them, but had decided was worth trying anyway. Dr. Moon, who'd since left Second Self entirely to consult for the very regulatory body now overseeing cognitive imprint law, gave a toast that made half the yard cry. Johan still hummed, sometimes songs he couldn't fully place. He still lost pieces of himself to gaps he'd likely never recover. But he no longer flinched at the not knowing. He'd stopped needing to be entirely one man or entirely the other, the boy who loved kalguksu on Sundays, or the version of him built from that boy's grief and given a second chance to finish a life someone else had tried to end early. He was, Ren told him once, on their porch, watching the plum tree lose its blossoms into the evening light, simply Johan, whole enough, loved enough, here, that they'd both decided was enough to build a life on. The end. Thank you for watching this Afro-K Tales original. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who believes love always finds its way home. New stories every week, only on Love Stories by Livia.